Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to another FS Club webinar. This is part of our CommunityZ Chest series. This is where we have feature a member of our community and let them get some stuff off their chest. And today, I'm really delighted to have an old friend of mine here, well, a young friend of mine, Vinay Gupta. Uh, Vinay and I have known each other a number of years. We'll be covering his life, but I still have one abiding memory, which is about 3 years ago. We were both in Stockholm and I was asked to chair a fireside chat with Vinay, and we were in the Opera Kellen above the Stockholm Opera, and just as the lights set in the distance, bang, up came the fire all around us. It was all the torches on the outside of the building. Let's hope we don't have anything like that, but maybe somebody will throw a community's chest full of money to us today. Anyway, Vinay, I'm really looking forward to this chat. Just a couple of quick words. Firstly, an enormous thanks to our sponsors. As ever, they are extremely tolerant, allowing us to range widely across technology, finance, and social purpose. And today we're going to be talking about social, technical, economic, and political issues. Vinay is truly a polymath, and you can read his CV and have read his CV already online. My job, of course, is to try and get out of your way and onto our guest. So the format today is a number of items, kind of what's Vinay really working on, what's the most surprising thing, what's he find funny. But we'd like to spend a bit of time on his thoughts on four themes: the social, technical, economic, and political futures. And we're looking forward to you asking questions. The GoToWebinar facility that you're using has a little question box. So please feel free to send me questions and we'll have a conversation, hopefully about 20, 25 minutes of questions with Vinay. But Vinay, your background is rich and I've pulled three items from it. Would you mind just explaining what is a hex at a time?
Sure. So in 2002, I invented a refugee shelter. And the point of this thing is that you can manufacture them in huge quantities because the walls are whole sheets of 4x8 just as it comes off the production line, and the roof pieces are half sheets. And it went on to be commercialized, a variant by an outfit called ShiftPod. And they're now using them in refugee camps. So we managed to get this thing all the way out. And it's used. It's not bad. It really is homed at a place called Burning Man, this big festival in America. And at Burning Man, they build about 5,000 to 10,000 units a year. So it's one of the dominant shelters on the playa. And it's all home construction. People are building them themselves.
Now, another link in your little timeline, this is your life, Vinay Gupta, you were the project manager, is that right, for the first launch of Ethereum in August 2015, the first edition.
Yes. So I joined the team late 2014, and my background in cryptography goes back into the kind of mid-90s. And the Ethereum thing was the first commercial implementation of smart contracts that looked like it would work. So I quit my job in academia, joined the team, and it's been amazing. Like, we had no idea it would become as big as it has.
Now, you decided, that whilst you've done all of this, which is exciting, and Ethereum continues quite strongly. It's had an interesting history with fork. Ethereum Classic has had an interesting history with that very, very famous DAO incident. But it still plows along, and we all keep a very close eye on it and are very interested in its further developments. But what I think is also interesting is you decided that it needed a further extension. Is that not correct?
Yes. So the whole point of smart contracts for me is that you could move around physical goods with the same kind of nuance and dexterity that you can move around various kinds of tokens, right? To try and bridge this physical-digital gap. So Mattereum is a digital identity firm that works on physical goods. And we issue these things called asset passports, which are kind of legal identities for valuable things, works of art, Star Trek collectibles. In fact, our first partner is William Shatner. And so we have a variety of Star Trek merchandise, which Shatner has signed, with all the videos and all the proofs and so on the blockchain. So you get these very, very, very securely defined collectibles. But that same mechanism could equally well be used for anything, boats, ships, real estate, you name it. But it's really about this concept of just giving things proper names.
Probably a small disclaimer that CN is somewhat involved in that project at a technical level, but that's a minor point.
And many of the people that have helped us along are people that we've asked you to introduce us to. A good part of our intellectual capital is actually, like good city know-how.
Anyway, so aside from creating a currency worth tens of billions and rehousing the planet, what is actually top of your in tray at the moment?
So right now I'm working on a book called The Future of Stuff for Tortoise. And it basically is a bit of a rumination on all the things we figured out about stuff in the process of building Mattereum. A lot of work on supply chains, a lot of work on supply chain ethics. The other thing is that I've been approached by some lovely people from South Africa about doing digital identities for farmed rhino horn. So the South Africans and a few other countries have decided that they're going to go after rhino farming in a big way because the Chinese really love rhino horn and they're all over Africa. And this brings up a number of moral questions. I don't know whether we're going to do the project or not, but it's definitely a thing that is on the top of my mind right now.
Wow.
And I've learned a lot about rhinos in the recent conversations. Apparently, temperamentally, they're basically a lot like horses. They're just a 3.5-ton horse that can flip over a car.
Yeah, this has been a long-running thing. The whole should we trade it? Should we manage it? The whole CITES, Endangered Species Act, etc.
Absolutely.
Rich area. Worth a whole conversation on its own.
2 weeks ago, apparently the South African government changed the law, and now it's all go. So I don't know whether we're going to do it or not. But it's an amazing thing to look at.
Now, I put a couple of things here to help the audience get a flavor of your personality. So, what's the most surprising or thought-provoking thing you've seen lately?
So over the quarantine, I rewatched a huge amount of the X-Files, basically because I just wanted something to do. And surely enough, it turns out that the X-Files is hugely predictive of modern culture. We've got all this UFO stuff that's been released by the US government. Here's our footage. We don't know what this is. Maybe you've got some ideas. We've got the whole Bill Gates vaccine conspiracy. And the Bill Gates vaccine conspiracy is almost exactly what the latter 3 seasons of the X-Files were about. This idea that people's smallpox vaccinations are being used to implant chips that allow you to track them is what the whole arc is about. And it showed on the Fox network, which as we know is also the home of things like Fox News. So I have a feeling that the kind of right-wing vaccine conspiracy thing is a dimly remembered imprint of the X-Files from 20 years ago that's now being recycled as truth.
One of the things that's interesting, of course, is we were chatting the other day together about transparent aluminium, weren't we? And that's actually out of Star Trek, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, it's amazing how much of the science fiction stuff comes around. Voice control, transparent aluminium, AI that almost kind of sort of works.
Well, no wonder you're teamed with William Shatner, Captain Kirk. Excellent. Now, one of the surprising things for our audience might be that you, despite being a somewhat iconoclastic, techie, anarcho-type nerd, are actually a member of the venerable, worshipful company of world traders in the city of London. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely.
Oh, great. Well, let's have a quick look here. What was your funniest thing you've seen lately?
So this is a lovely little cartoon from SMBC. And I quite like this idea that the robot rebellion would be the animals as well. I mean, it's just kind of like we are making kind of a mess of the world. And who's to say what robots and dogs might accomplish together?
Well, there's the Hitchcockian birds up there, that's for sure. And I saw the birds on the rhino. Should I be worried?
I always worry about the birds. I'm slowly becoming surrounded by ravens where I live. They're slowly going further along the balcony. I haven't found one in the kitchen yet, but it's only a matter of time.
Oh, I didn't realize. That's strange. I have an entire raven colony outside my door, too. Well, I wanted to structure this discussion a little bit to help the audience. So we spent sort of 8-9 minutes getting to know you a little bit, but now we want to know about your thinking. And just to help the audience, I cheated and went out and thought, how can we cover sort of 4 areas? And I wanted to look really at the old Rumsfeld quote where he divides the world into 3, unknown unknowns, known unknowns, and known knowns. The fourth one, which isn't in his quote, but I'm sure he was aware of, was unknown knowns, things that you aren't even aware are important, but you know them quite well. So, for example, a doctor who does well because he's got a great or she's got a great bedside manner and doesn't realize that when they move to telemedicine or something like that. But there's another category which surrounds all of this in a way, which is ignored knowns. And I would put COVID-19 firmly into that because we've had pandemics in the past. We even had a film, Contagion, in 2011, which laid things out very, very well.
Oh yeah.
It's almost a script for this. They clearly listened to the Center for Disease Control as their advisors when creating it. So that was the sort of thought. But you then pointed out to me, Vinay, that my concept of ignored knowns had long been around. Do you want to just chat about some other African animals?
Well, so the ignored knowns kind of come in two kinds, right? There's the kind that you focused on, which is sort of implicit knowledge or things that were in front of you that you didn't see. And because I'd been doing a bunch of disaster relief stuff, got very interested in the other branch of this, which is things that people see but they don't want to think about. It's like two places in the chain of conception where things get interrupted. So we called this the black elephant because 10 years ago when we thought of it, the black swan was very fashionable. The black swan, the black swan. And what we kept finding was that the problem wasn't black swans. It was things that everybody knew about, but they didn't want to think about, they didn't want to deal with. Pandemic flu, economic collapse, civil wars, all of these big risks, asteroid strikes, that are completely understood, but nobody's doing anything about them. So we called these black elephants. And the black elephant is quite a trip. It's gotten written about in the New York Times, New Scientist. Peter Ho, who's a big wheel in the defense world in Singapore, teaches it. So yeah, the black elephant has gone on a good wander around. And now we're knee deep in the black elephant stampede.
Yeah. It's one of the things, I've been deeply involved with elephants for years. One of the things that I've always taken away was Vivek Vaidya in India, pointing out they're very large, highly intelligent migratory beasts, and that for years we'd ignored the migratory. Yeah. Well, look, we chose together 4 subjects to range around social, technical, economic, and political. And I'll start really with the first one, and just to get the audience going on this type of a look ahead. We thought we'd spend a couple of minutes on the end of the office.
Well, we're living it, right? I mean, you're at home, I'm at home. We've got our headsets and our cameras and all the rest of that stuff. The 20-foot commute, it's been kind of an aspiration in technology for a long time. Programmers generally love working from home. Is it going to catch up with the rest of the world? I don't know. I mean, do you think, can finance function this way? Everybody making their deals from their back gardens, or do you really need the proximity?
Well, I think the key thing here is we've been struggling for years with the whole notion of using this. I think the big lesson we've learned is mixed mode doesn't work very well. I mean, this stuff's been around for 20 years. Skype was a big trend-setting thing in 2003. And yet loads of people my age hadn't even used any of this kit until 3 months ago. So, what was preventing it? And I think the truth is, 1, people are hard to change behaviorally. 2, we've all been on those horrible conference calls in a meeting room where one person is dominating the room because they've got the speakerphone and they can't see the interaction with other people. We needed everybody to move at once. However, the early numbers appear to indicate that only about 25% of jobs could really be fully done from home. And so the question is that 75% a noyau dur, in other words, you can't do anything about it, or will it start to accrete as time goes on? Because a lot of that analysis is effectively based on historic analysis. And a really good example to me is things like telepsychiatry and telemedicine, with percentage of GDP taken by health, and being able to do all of that up front doesn't turn up in the official numbers. So I don't think we'll get below 50%, but 50% is a big change. What do you think?
So I'm interested in it as a class divide. That the middle classes can, generally speaking, work from home, and the working class, generally speaking, have to still turn up in the factory. And that notion that, work from home becomes an aspirational lifestyle because it indicates that you've become white collar, I think is, on one hand, potentially quite good environmentally and so on, and on the other hand, you just wonder what happens in the workplace if the workplace is the place where the people at the bottom of the pyramid are.
I've got a really cool comment/question from Bob McDowell. I think you know Bob. If we work at home, how can we effectively disconnect from work? Or perhaps we should never disconnect from work. Comments, please.
Yeah, I mean, so the crux of this is the 2 laptop lifestyle, where you have, one laptop where you've got your laptop for work and your iPad for everything else, and you need to segregate it by physical device. So when the work laptop closes, that's the end of the day.
Wow. Yeah. So, well, you've been living that life for a while, so it's a habit that you have to get into, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, for us, when we were initially setting up Mattereum, we all got apartments in the same neighborhood, and that was a really good equilibrium. We had about half of the company within a 5-minute walk. And that was great. That was exactly the right level of proximity, because there was no office. But it was, you just wander over to, Vinay's living room, and we'd sit around the kitchen table, and then everybody would go home and do the actual work.
Well, I see two trends. One is fairly obvious, which is changes in property structures. So commercial property perhaps being less valuable with only a temporary bit about distancing, maybe keeping the demand up a little bit. Next thing is, of course, if we're all working from home, I want an extra 500 square feet. In fact, I'm actually doing up a room at the moment to turn it more studio-like. So that'll change the demand for domestic. But I think there's a third knock-on effect, which is actually quality of life. That people are going to say, well, look, if I'm actually at home, I want to live someplace that's nicer, and this could push the outer burbs or the rurals in different ways.
San Francisco property prices informally are said to be in free fall. Like rental, not purchase, but rental apparently, because the techies, now the places like Twitter have said, yeah, work from home as long as you like. People are just like, Montana, Colorado.
Here in London, we got some early indicators that some of the outer burbs are actually going up slightly in value, while the rest, the general market's declining, or at least going up relatively. Another point really is, we've heralded the death of distance for ages. We've also heralded the rise of the service economy, and yet the service economy has always been seen to be something that's hard to export. And whilst we may not be exporting barber services, in fact, we may not be going to the barber ever again. In our case,
yeah, my hair has actually never been longer. Longest is
funny enough. I've learned about my own hair. It's doable. But the point really is that could this actually lead to a boom? Could a positive aspect of this be a boom in service exports around the world?
Well, I mean, this is the white collar services, right? So lawyers, accountants, audits, all this kind of stuff. In theory, a lot of that work could go anywhere in the world. In practice, I still wonder how much of it depends on trust and discovery. And if the work from home thing goes on for decades, if it's just the economics switch. Tell what the prior is on this. It's actually end of World War II where women come into the workplace. And suddenly the meaning of home changes because home is actually empty 8 hours a day. And now it's like the workplace is moving into the home. So there's these structural changes, maybe ratchets where it changes and never comes back. And if that happens, how do we build trust relationships with people that we're never going to physically meet?
We've got 3 more subjects to cover, but I'll just try and wrap this up because there's some interesting comments I'd like to feed into this. Remember our former master, Edwina Morton,
yes.
of the Virtual Company of World Traders. Hello, Edwina. She points out, isn't this also a generational divide in that younger folk have less comfortable space to work in? Thomas Barker points out, if we can all work from home, won't the world's elite all move to Bali and Andalusia, or whatever is the current phrase? But much of the developed world only has good weather 4 to 6 months of the year. And Angel Gaviero Bestiero points out, do we risk that many confirmed work from home occupations are more likely to be outsourced to cheaper labor cost locations? Which I think is an extremely interesting point, because we might see a boom in service exports amongst accountants, lawyers, project managers, consultants in the West, but only temporarily, because suddenly I realize I don't care where these people are from as I get used to new ways of working. So really good stuff there, folks. But let's move on to the next topic we were going to sort of gas about, and that was to have a look at technical and kind of the concept of total mediation. And I think the bottom 2 photos from memory are actually from a fellow by the name of Henry Chong, who presents regularly at Burning Man. I think that's a picture of Burning Man on the right, in a right bottom, where we would have seen many hexiards.
You can see one in the background there. So McLuhan's, medium is the message and all the rest of this. We're having a conversation right now over a platform that somebody else owns and designs the affordances for. And the notion of, completely mediated life is that all of our contact with other human beings goes over platforms which are owned by third parties. And that is extremely disturbing, right? I mean, in the long run, there's no way that if corporations are invested with that kind of power, they're not going to abuse it in dramatic ways. And because the rate of technological change is so quick, it's unlikely that government will be able to sensibly regulate those kind of uses. You see a little of this with people that get kicked off Google, and suddenly their websites go down, and they can't talk to anybody, and their email is gone. And it doesn't happen very often, but if people mistake you for committing major fraud, that kind of stuff goes on. How are we to ensure that people have civil rights in an environment where what they're attempting to regulate is corporate behavior over what amount to commons?
Do you see, we sort of have a fork in that regard with the dark web. Now, I know that's heavily tainted by drugs, human trafficking, weaponry, all that. But is there a need for some kind of effectively unmediated space where there are no passwords? I kind of launch myself into it, and that's segregated. Because I remember when I started programming in the early 70s, the password was there to make sure on time-sharing machines somebody else didn't come along and accidentally write over your code. It wasn't there to protect sensitive information, my health records, or my money. It wasn't at all about that. It was just a little device where we were all working mutually. Could we maybe set up a free zone like that?
Well, so about 5 years ago, I figured out that the internet that I'd encountered first in the kind of early 90s felt the way it did because it was all academic privilege. It was a bunch of nerds, and there was an accountability mechanism if they behaved, which was you wrote to their system administrators, and they got yelled at. So, it was not unregulated space. It was incredibly tightly regulated space in which academic privilege was exercised as it always has been. So I think there's a role here for, a kind of a global village where every village has a sheriff. Right? I think that you could have a system where you have accountability, but it's community accountability, and it's community accountability that's based around individuals with reputations. If you vouch for 50 people in your network that they'll behave themselves if they're on my platform, and one of them misbehaves and I say to you, this guy's out of line, I think we need brokered trust for these kind of arrangements. Because the alternative is the kind of spam-filled wasteland, or the kind of stuff you see on the dark web. So I'm in favor of really putting the sheriff back in town, because it's either going to be done by individuals of good character that take a leadership position in their communities, or it's going to be done by underpaid drones working for faceless corporations that make horrible decisions.
Well, we're going to move on a little bit. Now, this next subject here, the sort of third area we wanted to have a little look at, was an economic ignored node, or black elephant, which has been rising to the fore. If we've managed to successfully ignore COVID-19 and pandemics since 2003, or the 2009, or the 2012, or even the Spanish flu, or even the plague, we know they're there. We've managed to ignore it. This is one with 100% casualty rate, according to the scientists. Whatever the time period is one thing, but 100% casualty the way that things are going. So this leads me to wonder, in a way, your book about stuff, which I like. Great George Carlin sketch about stuff. Life is all about just stuff, moving your stuff.
Right.
Yeah. What does the book have to say about this issue?
So about half of the book is very specifically about carbon footprint management. Right? And my feeling about this is that most of the stuff in the world is designed to basically be throwaway. And that doesn't have to be that way, right? If we design things for long-term value, I buy it, I use it, when I'm done I sell it, the next user buys it and uses it, and then they sell it. The actual market for, say, high-end cameras is enormous if the cameras work for 20 years, and at the latter part of their life they cost $300. Right? The problem that we have is that far too much of the expensive stuff that we're going to all this work to make breaks and is then discarded. So what I'm really pushing for is a model where we invest in long life of durable goods with the expectation that they'll be resold maybe dozens of times over their lifespan, rather than the current model where the goods degrade so quickly and the knowledge about the goods degrades so quickly that they wind up in landfills or they wind up being sold for $50 when they are actually still worth 500. So it's about fighting the loss of knowledge which goes along the second-hand markets.
Yeah, it is a definitely an area where I just don't see where we're going to get society to pay for it. An old story of mine is that I had my first debate on climate change in the city in 1984. That's 36 years ago, and it ended with, does society really want to pay? Because the costs are not insignificant.
Yeah,
but what's the choice?
it's
a tough one.
But they're rounding errors when you compare them to defense budgets, right? I mean, I think the answer to this is treaties. Because if the world's major militaries said, right, here's what's going to happen. We're all going to spend 20% less on armament and we're going to put that money into carbon. I think most of the world's militaries would take that deal because they don't want to be fighting in a resource-constrained desert global economy. They'd much rather prevent that.
Now, COVID-19 gives us an opportunity to think. I mean, it's had a number of effects. One, I love the statistic that more people have been saved through reduced pollution in China than died from COVID-19 because of the slowdown of economic activity. We've seen the potential. We spoke earlier about home working, but although it's a nice little 3-month indicator, it's miles away from what is claimed we need to achieve. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the CO2 output drops have been estimated to be as low as 5 or 10%. And it gives you a sense of, you could do a whole-scale reorganization of society and still have only cut the carbon by 1/10 of what we need to. I mean, the US is at 17 tons per person. It needs to be about 3 tons per person. The kind of lifestyle changes implied in cutting your carbon consumption by 80% are really large. And I think this is the kind of warning signal of okay, guys, rearranging the existing economy is not going to get you where you need to go, right? We have to think much more systemically.
And we've got decarbonization down here as economic, because that's where we wanted to focus. There are a lot of technical things we could talk about, but what lessons can we learn from the economic response to COVID about what should or shouldn't be done via decarbonization?
I mean, here we have this thing of we keep printing money and it keeps not causing inflation, right? So if we can print money and it doesn't cause inflation for COVID bailouts, we ought to be able to print money and not have it cause inflation for things like decarbonization. Now, that's naive, but this notion that printing money is bad because it causes inflation has been such an element of doctrine forever that I just don't understand why we were able to print so much money and not have inflation and then not use that mechanism for other things.
Now, you and I were speaking, I mean, there's a fellow out here, Learning Work, as the title goes by, asking about what if the money supply pyramid was inverted, money creation was happening to sovereignty. Shan Turnbull is always talking about can we move to some type of energy consumption sort of currency. George Monbiot, I think, is something I'm quite fond of. I'm not sure the first two, but he talks about land value taxes. Do you think there's a way to reorganize the monetary system and the fiscal system to perform better against decarbonization, or is it just a fairly straightforward, if you want to do it, get the job done?
So market economies are really good for doing innovation, but the practical business of utility level operations inside a society is almost entirely driven by regulation. So I think that we're in a position where we're not going to get transformation of things like power utilities except through a very different approach to regulation. As for the financial impact, I mean, the obvious game plan here is that you pay people a basic income and then you proceed to break the economy and remake it into something that works in a carbon neutral way. So if you have basic income, you can handle the distortion of we have enormous numbers of people who've been thrown out of jobs and it takes the economy 5 years to figure out how to redeploy them. Well, for those 5 years you were on basic income and you didn't lose your house. Deal. Because if we don't create that padding, the kind of economic restructuring you have to do to get the economy onto the green trajectory will cause revolutions. So I think, basic income is the social stabilizer, and then once the social stabilizer is in place, that's when you start breaking things. Because if we don't break things, we're not going to get this done.
It's an interesting, yeah. very, very interesting. Adopting a very much a kind of a West Coast, just break it, get it going. Okay. Yeah. Well, evolution leads us nicely on to. We wanted to chat about whether or not politics was fit for purpose, and I needed to find a slide as a bit of eye candy. So I actually typed in fit for purpose, and up popped this extremely recent poster from the Liberal Democrats here in the United Kingdom. Interesting to see what is it? Certainly a mainstream center, perhaps center-left party, getting this radical. So, is politics fit for purpose? You wanted to chat about what needed to change, and I'd be delighted to hear it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem is that we just can't get 4-year, democracy working properly. The world changes very, very, very rapidly, and a lot of the things that we need to deal with unfold over decades. So this clocking of policy to you do it now and then 4 years later you harvest the result at an election means that if the problem doesn't really exist on a 4-year cycle, you can't get politicians to pay attention to it. So the short term and the long term have both gotten thrown completely out of the window. So I think we need forms of continuous decision making. The simplest one is the idea of continuous election of MPs. So every 3 or 4 days, one MP is re-elected, and there is no general election. So you just stagger the electoral dates for every constituency. You know what constituency will be elected when, and you just have a continuous electoral process, because at that point the governments don't have the option of screwing everybody over in the first 6 months that they're in power, and then slowly patching everything up until the next election.
It's interesting that you and I have both pondered this. At the end, we put forward a concept of continuous voting, slightly different than a continuous election. In other words, I could spark an election at any time. I basically get a vote a day, and I can save it up. So I'm very happy with you. And then suddenly, you're caught in bed with the wrong sort of person or whatever gets my goat. And I say, well, I've actually got 730 votes, and I now wish to vote against you, or use to vote. So in other words, you've got this kind of ability, and so the public can keep the politicians on a short tether by casting their vote every day. I will cast it, but I don't have a horde. Politicians can try and appeal to the horde for major change and do that. The other thing that we've been proposing, and this is, it speaks clearly, your whole point about we're very bad at long term. I think democracy is in some ways too good at making decisions. We get up and make a decision every day. Our problem is sticking to them. We've seen this in the United Kingdom with Heathrow. We've seen it with HS2. We've seen it with all sorts of things. So what you really want is something that binds people to a decision, makes them understand the enormity of it. One of the proposals we made some 15 years ago, which is starting to catch up in the corporate world, take off in the corporate world, is the idea of a policy performance bond. So you set out the policy you're going to achieve so that people can align with you. As a government, we're going to do net zero in Britain to go back to our decarbonization point. And for every bit you're off target, you pay a higher percentage rate. So we've got 30 years, that's 3.3% a year. So 3 years into it, you should be 9.9% down, but you're only 5% down. And this pays 4.9%. So, it's a good hedge against government. And if government can't sell the thing, it actually means people believe they're going to do it. So interesting.
Yeah. I like that kind of economic coupling model. But we have to be clear that power and money are two separate things. Yeah. So the economic coupling will work for one half of the equation. On the other half of the equation, we still need to be able to generate the mandates to drive those changes.
Well, Thomas Barker is sort of curious, what are your thoughts on commodity-based currencies? Would they help with the adjustments required by decarbonization?
So yes, but. And the yes is yes, but not as a substitute for example, debt-based currency. I think we'd get a lot more done if we had a plethora of different currencies that accomplish different functions that weren't tied to nation-state borders. Because what that allows for is simpler approaches to hedging risk. If copper trading was done in a copper currency, then rather than generating enormous seas of futures contracts and so on, people would just hold the copper currency until they needed copper. And you would have a nicely balanced risk on those kind of things. And I think that sort of an approach, it's not going to work for everything, but it would be, part of a basket of trying to build a system where there's a much more direct connection between decisions and implementation. Because if you think of the amount of craft involved in doing things like futures contracts, all of that's replaced if you can make these things work like currencies and then do things like loans.
Well, Adrian Gaviero Bastiero has come back with a point that's aligned with this. And whilst you point out that the economic and the political zones do differ, nevertheless they meet in central banks. He's curious, what do you think about stable coins and central bank versus private control of them?
Yeah. So central banking gives you a choke point for the function of an entire economy, generally speaking, in the hands of a set of people that were not elected. You have to consider whether or not the central banks should be elected, or should they be independent in the same way that, say, the US Supreme Court is independent. If they're going to have this kind of political independence, then the question is, well, should I be able to buy into somebody else's central banking? And right now we can do that by, for example, storing our wealth in Swiss francs or, Albanian dinars, wherever it is. The hardest question on this is the relationship between the political boundary and the central bank boundary. Like, if these guys are not being elected by a population, why then should the central bank radius be identical with the radius of that nation state? So if you had a central bank for the oil industry and it was the entire global oil industry used that central bank for all of our oil transactions, maybe that provides you with something which is genuinely stabilizing at the global level, industry by industry, so we could decouple the central banks from the nation states.
Okay. Just a final point here before we move along. Both David Wood and Bob McDowell are interested in the democracy and political thinking. And Bob says, is Vinay suggesting that executive government has no future? And it's interesting to me because you introduced me and got me quite interested in liquid democracy, which has had a kind of a Northern European tinge to it. I think you were heavily involved in Iceland, and yet you haven't seen that as a success. Is that correct?
I'm quite skeptical about liquid democracy because of what we've seen from the press. So I think liquid democracy works quite well at a kind of project level.
Sorry, I realize we're probably in our own zone. Do you want to just explain to the audience in a nutshell
sure.
what it is? Sorry there.
So liquid democracy is this idea of delegated voting. So you have a set of issues you're being asked to make a decision on, and you simply delegate your vote to people that you think will vote in the direction which is correct. So, this is a medical issue. I'm going to delegate that vote to my friend Bob who follows medicine. This is an international relations issue. Okay, that one's going to go to Michael. Oh, this is an environment issue. That one I want control. I'm going to cast my votes myself. So it provides this way of creating kind of like micro-representation.
And also the issues themselves, the experts help to define those issues. Is that right?
My take on it has always been that you need two tiers of experts. The first group decide what the issue is about, and then the second group come along and kind of provide options on it. But the hitch with this,
which is interesting when we look at some of these experiments on People's Fora. They go by a variety of words, but Ireland's tried it, others have tried it, where they assemble a representative group of people, a bit like a Kurt Vonnegut novel, where they chose. Remember, they choose the average person to cast the one vote that day.
Yes. Absolutely. Sorry, I startled because an enormous raven just flew at my window.
I sent them over. Anyway,
but very Harry Potter.
Just quickly, what is this the case that executive government has no future, or is it just this could work well with it?
So it's 300 years out of date as a model, right? I mean, it's back to the horse and cart days, and we haven't modernized it to keep pace with technology. So executive government, yeah, for sure, but the representation of the will of the people to the government could be massively overhauled, and then the transparency of the government systems. Nobody really knows what's happening inside of the departments, and the departments have enormous implementation power. So a kind of structural opening out, I think, is extremely important, because we've got the ability to do it now. And we didn't have the ability to do it 300 years ago, and if they had, if I really want to upset Americans, I say, what do you think the American founding fathers would have done with America's political structure if they had the internet as a starting point? Do you really think they would have picked, an X on a piece of paper once every 4 years, and that was the end of your participation? They would have laughed until they fell over if you knew that was how you ran your democracy in the age of the internet. What would Jefferson have said?
It's difficult to see. A lot of people understand what intellectual radicals they were. Yes, Jefferson and Washington owned slaves. Yes, they were large landowners, but politically they were at the forefront, and they were in many ways technologically constrained. You had to send the horse and cart from deepest Virginia up to Boston because that was the corridor, and it was not an easy thing to do.
Not an easy thing to do. And I mean, the Hamilton musical, there's a whole bunch of fussiness in that. And I don't know how historical it is. My American early history is patchy.
Oh, it's pretty good.
About the fact that the deal was they were going to move the capital closer to the south because it was easier for them to get to it. Right? We have no such constraint, right? What is going on here? So that notion of so if we're all about founders' intent, which is quite a popular position in America, founders' intent is not that you run the country on paper with elections every 4 years. That is crazy talk. So that question of what would we do if we were genuinely going to make a democracy that worked in the world that we're currently in, I've never heard a good answer for that, but it's nothing like this.
Yeah, this is where you and I sort of maybe have often parted ways, which is to do with I tend to define money as technology communities use to trade debts across space and time, and then within that, fiat currency to me is the trading of tax credits. That's what I call it. And I can see Trevor Hilder and Bob McDowell piping up with Trevor says, isn't the U.S. dollar in reality a global currency backed by oil? Bob McDowell is looking at the confidence in a currency of whatever spec. But the thing to me is that government is a monopoly on the use of force in a specified geographic area. Therefore, the monetary system records that. And one of the problems I foresee in a lot of this is that the maintenance of that geographic area leads to increased tensions in defense terms. So I'm sort of curious about where that goes.
Yes. So, very concisely, agricultural land used to be the generator of value. So governments became things which herded agricultural land. But now agricultural land is 1% of the UK economy, and it's not much more for America. And in a lot of cases, agriculture is actually a cost center rather than a profit center because it has to be massively subsidized or it just stops in rich countries. So what the state really protects at this point is trade. Right? It takes us back to the world traders. But really what we're interested in is protection of trade, protection of trade routes. And that work is largely corporate now. Right? The corporations manage trade in the same way that the governments manage land. And because we haven't accorded the corporations political rights or put them under democratic control, we have a position where one part of the government manages archaic systems, which is land, and we can control it, and the other part of the government manages trade, and it manages the modern systems, and these systems are out of control democratically. So I think that we need to think of governments as things that manage value rather than things that manage land. And from there, it becomes much easier to see what governments really are. In terms of what we do about this, I think that the city-states are, in the long run, going to turn out to be the only things that can cope with the rate of change. And then the question is, how do we manage the hinterlands around the city-states?
Well, city-states have certainly taken a hit with COVID, which is, given that their core advantage is intensity.
Well, you see, it's all up in the air now, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't gather that intensity. But that's for another chat. I'm already getting things like, please do pass on my thanks to Vinay for this fascinating, thought-provoking talk, which is a sign, sadly, that we've come to the end of our 3/4 of an hour. But I did say to you that you had an opportunity to ask the audience to do something. What is your ask, Vinay?
So there's a subgenre of science fiction called cyberpunk, which was very big in the 80s and 90s. And my request is that people go back and read an anthology called Mirror Shades, which was kind of one of the seminal collections of cyberpunk. Or if you just want the kind of quick and gory details, a role-playing game, like a Dungeons and Dragons thing called Cyberpunk 2020, which I played to death in the 1980s. Well, I mean, we're now in 2020, and it's quite funny to see how it's all turned out. So, yeah.
Back to the X-Files. I must say, I have read Mirror Shades, and so I too would commend it as a very good anthology of a very important genre. from people like my dear friend Neil Stevenson. So, he wrote Snow Crash and Cryptonomicon and others. So I think this is a really fascinating ask because it's a bit like, take your five or eat your greens and eat your fruits. Folks, Vinay's asking, read your sci-fi, please.
Read your sci-fi, right? Because it's the literacy of the present, Like the Brontes are all very well if you have Bronte problems, but right now what we've got is crypto problems and stability of government problems and corporate takeover of policing problems, and that's all cyberpunk material.
Well, I would commend folks to think that if you go to the Gresham College website, gresham.ac.uk, there's a fascinating lecture given by Neil Stevenson where he points out it's not so much science fiction as speculative fiction, and he divides that from normal fiction. So normal fiction being sort of about relationships, and speculative fiction being about what if I could change one thing in the world, what would the consequences be, and taking that to the extreme. But that's for another day. I just wanted to end on one final question, Vinay. The FS Club is about technology and finance, but it has a bull-bear motif. So looking to the future, are you bullish or are you bearish?
So in a world where solar panels are cheaper than coal and they're getting cheaper by 10, 15, 20% every year, it's impossible to be long-term bearish. Right? Free energy falls from the sky and the microprocessors are incredibly cheap. We're going to work this out, right? But if we don't figure out how to tear down not fit for purpose structures at 50 times the pace we're doing it, the oil companies are going to continue to bribe the governments to do the wrong thing and to subsidize the hell out of them, and the world will go to hell in a handbasket before we clean it up. It's how deep a trough do we dig for ourselves before we apply the technologies to build ourselves a functional utopia, rather than applying the technologies to build an enormous pit and then bulldoze ourselves into it, which is what we're doing now.
Well, you make a great economist on the one hand and on the other, but I'm glad to see you're basically optimistic, which I think we should always be. Always be optimistic. Pessimistic for better times.
If we didn't have the cheap solar panels, I would be very pessimistic. But we do, so at that point, we should just get on with this.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to drag this to a close, sadly, and I do mean sadly, and perhaps we can have you back for a couple of the subjects that you've spoken about, whether it's sci-fi, or what Mattereum's doing, or some of the stuff about stuff, or climate change. I'd be absolutely delighted, but I must do three sets of thanks, so you can hold on for a minute, Vinay. My first set of thanks is very clearly to our sponsors. Without you, we would be incapable of doing this, and we do genuinely really appreciate the fact that you let us range this widely and freely without any editorial control, which is lovely. Many of you provide goods and services that are important for the four major areas that Vinay was talking about, and look forward to seeing you again. I would like to thank you, the audience. Without you, there's no point in doing this, and appreciate all the comments and questions. We haven't had time to get around to quite everything, but it really has been super to see you getting involved in this. We do have another webinar tomorrow, and it's not sci-fi, although it might sound it, quantum-resistant encryption. Maurice Schenk, who wrote a report with me a while back, is going to be talking not about quantum computing so much as oh my gosh, it's a threat from the skies, but what can we practically do about it today? And there are some things, simple things he's going to recommend, and it should be a fun discussion. Anyway, meanwhile, my biggest thanks must go to you, Vinay. I count you as a friend, and I'm delighted that you spent the time with me today. Unfortunately, in this modern WFH, work from home, office on the road community, it's a little hard to let everybody in on the call to give you applause. So I will represent everybody with my traditional thank you gong. And I would like to thank you very much for your time today, and we hope to see you again soon.
Really fun, Michael. Really fun. Thanks, everybody, and catch me on Twitter if you got more questions.
Okay. Bye, all. Ciao.